Hey guys, this is Ben, aka Iron Brigade Piper, coming to you on a late Friday night from my back patio with another edition of This Day in History. So I want you guys to imagine with me, if you will, that you're standing on the deck of a massive warship. And it's a beautiful morning, peaceful morning. You're just enjoying the morning breeze off the sea. And all of a sudden, your peace is shattered by the sound of hundreds of cannons booming and firing off at once. And you look to your left and to your right, and you see a massive armada of ships firing cannon shell after cannon shell. And you hear the boom and the crack of heavy 32-pound cannons sending their shot and shell screaming downrange towards a tiny little fort that you can see on the mainland. Well, a similar scene happened on September 13 and 14th of 1814. And the name of the tiny little fort that was being bombarded was Fort McHenry. And on one of these massive warships, they were British warships, was standing a gentleman by the name of Francis Scott Key, observing this whole massive attack. Now, Francis Scott Key was a successful lawyer from Washington, D.C., and he found himself on the deck of a British warship that day because he had made the trip down to Baltimore. Fort McHenry was located at the mouth of the harbor to Baltimore. It was the main defense for the harbor. But he wasn't traveling to Fort McHenry. He actually traveled to meet with the British to discuss the release of one of his close friends, Dr. William Beanes. Dr. William Beanes was a civilian who had been taken captive by the British. And Francis Scott Key was able to successfully negotiate the release of his friend. But the British wouldn't allow him and Dr. Beanes to leave until their attack on the fort had been completed. So Francis Scott Key found himself standing on the deck of a British warship, observing an attack on his countrymen. And the British bombarded, I can't talk tonight. They bombarded that tiny little fort for 25 hours continuously. They started at 6 a.m. on the morning of September 13th, 1814, and they fired on the fort until all their shot and shell had been expended, till around 7 a.m. on September 14th. And Francis Scott Key, I could only imagine him just standing on the deck of this British warship observing this massive bombardment by just hundreds of British warships. And hoping beyond hope that the U.S. defenders wouldn't succumb to the attack. And I could only imagine that Francis Scott Key didn't get much sleep that night because it was a loud night with all those cannons and rockets going off. And he comes up from below decks in the morning of September 14th, and he looks to the shoreline, again just hoping beyond hope that the defenders prevailed. And what does he see flying over Fort McHenry? He looks and he sees the Star-Spangled Banner still proudly flying over the fort. The defenders had successfully defended the entrance to the Bay of Baltimore. What an inspiring sight. And he was so inspired that he quickly took quill to paper and he scribbled down the famous words of what we now know as the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of our great nation. A lot of people don't realize what a momentous day this was in our nation's history. They don't know a lot about the War of 1812. It was an obscure little conflict that not many people know of. In the grand scheme of things, it was probably considered another theater of the Napoleonic Wars. The war started in June of 1812, and it concluded in February of 1815. And the United States got involved in the war at the time. If you guys recall your history classes, during that time, Great Britain and a coalition of allies was fighting Napoleon Bonaparte on the European continent. And the way we got involved in the war was due to some trade disputes that we had with Great Britain at the time. You see, Great Britain was, and her allies were blockading France at the time, and they were preventing all international trade from going into France. And as you guys can imagine, France was a major trading partner of ours at the time, and we challenged this blockade as illegal under international law because it was having a huge impact on our economy at the time. To make matters worse, England was also boarding U.S. merchant ships, and they were implementing a policy of impressment, and they were pressing U.S. sailors into service. So basically what impressment is they kidnap U.S. sailors and force them to serve in the Royal Navy. Which, as you can imagine, caused quite an uproar in the United States at the time. Excuse me. Tap this down a little. And to make matters worse, the United States was also attempting to expand westward at the time into Illinois and territories out west, other territories. And England was supplying weapons to the Native Americans in those regions so that they could more successfully stifle our expansion west, which caused even more friction between the two nations, between Great Britain and the United States. So in 1812, June of 1812, James Madison, the President of the United States at that time, signed a declaration of war against Great Britain. And for the first 2 years, there was some skirmishes, and there was also some invasion attempts on our part into Canada that were thrown back by the British. But in 1814 was when the conflict really heated up, because the war in Europe was kind of winding down. I think at that point they had exiled Napoleon to the island of Elba, and England was able to send more troops over to the United States to aid in their warfare there. And they sent an expedition that landed in Maryland, and they marched on Washington, D.C., and they actually burned the White House and the Library of Congress down, and their next target was Baltimore. And that's where we find ourselves in this story of Francis Scott Key and his witnessing to the attack on Fort McHenry. But just reflecting on that today, he penned those words, and it didn't immediately become the national anthem of the United States. This pipe won't stay lit. It was put to the tune of a famous drinking song at the time, and it became more and more popular over the years. And in 1916, Woodrow Wilson declared that it should be played at all major events in the United States. But it wasn't until, I believe it was 1931, somewhere in the early 1930s, that it actually was declared the official national anthem of the United States of America. I'm just sitting here today thinking about just the inspiring words of that song and the indomitable spirit of the defenders of Fort McHenry to just overcome and endure such a punishing bombardment for 25 hours. Just thinking about the indomitable spirit of the United States people throughout the history of our nation, and this coming on the heels of our 18-year anniversary of 9/11, and how a lot of you guys talked the other day about just this indomitable spirit that this country has during times of crisis. I just think of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I and World War II, 9/11, all the stuff this country's been through. Just gives you something to think about. But yeah, that's this day in history. September 14th, 1814. The words to our national anthem were penned. So I hope you guys enjoyed this edition of This Day in History. Hope you are having a wonderful evening, and I hope you're ready for a wonderful weekend, guys. This is Iron Brigade Piper, signing out.